Welcome back to the channel, everybody. I'm Trevor with Maker Experiment, and in today's video, I'm going to show you how to engrave cutting boards. Let's get into it. First off, the most important thing is to know exactly what your client wants. So for the boards I'm doing today, the client actually wants to fill the engraving with epoxy, which means that it needs to be deeper than just a regular engraving that I would normally do. For a normal engraving, those are really easy. You just put the board in, choose your settings, and you're done. Not a big deal. But when you're talking about boards that are bigger than your work area or boards that need multiple engravings, those are the things that I'm going to talk about today. I actually have 5 boards to do. Now, 2 of them fit into the laser, no problem. Keep in mind that I am going to be using the Epilog Fusion Edge, which has a work area of 12 by 24. Now, 12 by 24 is big enough for a lot of projects. For example, this board is one of the ones that I have to do. It's 9 by 12. This is no big deal. That laser will run it every day. But I get a lot of questions about what do I do if it's bigger than my workspace? Like this board, which is more like 18 by 14 and a half. So the 14 and a half is bigger than what my specified work area is. And this is the board that I'm going to use in my example. The first thing I want to do is show you how I'm going to fit this board into the 12 by 24 machine so that I can actually work with it. Okay, so I'm over here at the machine. This grid is 12 by 24. That doesn't mean that the allowable space is 12 by 24. If I take this board and try to fit it in, you'll see that I hit the gantry. Or if I try to load it in the other way, there's a shelf here that it ends up hitting, so it's constantly at a diagonal. Now, one thing that I found to get by this, just to get the material into the bed, is actually to open up the front cover. If I have it like this where it's resting against the gantry, right now it's actually hitting the front panel. So the front panel is stopping it from going down and shifting and sliding back. If the gantry was not in that spot, I could slide this back underneath of it and then the front lid would be closed. But seeing as that's not the case, I'm going to have to take the front panel off, put the board in to put the front panel back on. So let me show you that real quick. So to get the panel off, I have to take out these 2 screws and then slide it down. Once I get the front panel off, you can see the board and how it just doesn't have enough room with that angle to slide through here. So what I'm going to do is take the board out, slide it through this way until it gets to the back and touches the back of the machine. Now you can see that it is still going to be just proud of this surface. But while I'm engraving, what I do is I go through and just put the cover back on the best that I can to make sure that no beams or anything come out. Now, you're technically not supposed to do this, so make sure you're taking all safety precautions. Wear the proper eyewear. Make sure you're as careful as possible. But this will allow you to do these large boards that are technically bigger than your work area. Now for the design side. For me, the design is actually super easy with these because this client gives me everything I need. All I do is import the images and then engrave them. So from that perspective, it's pretty simple. When I say he makes it easy, I mean easy. He gives me the artwork in a PNG form that's a pretty high resolution image. He also labels each cutting board with what goes on it and where he wants it placed. When I say that these are the clients you want, these are the clients you want. Easiest ones to work with. They give you everything you need and they make your job super quick. So what I'm going to do is just load the design for this cutting board, which says QB logo. So I'll grab that, grab the logo. And typically what I do is use the camera on the actual laser to place it just to make sure it'll go in the right spot. The images he gives me are already to the size that I need. So again, I don't have to make any changes for that. But I do need to make sure I adjust my settings to Engrave for a depth that will allow him to add epoxy to it. Now, typically, instead of one really deep engraving that goes really slow, I typically like to do a couple passes that will take away material each time, because I find the surface finish ends up better in the end, and it just works a little bit better. Now, one thing to keep in mind when you are working with wood is wood has a grain direction. So as you can see here, you can see the lines in the wood. And if you're not familiar with working with wood, there's a lot to be said about cutting, engraving, and everything else. Because what's going to happen with this is you can engrave this two ways. You can engrave with the grain or opposite the grain. Now, if you do it opposite the grain, you tend to have a little bit better result if it is a very open grain wood. So it's something like oak, for example. The laser beam can actually go in between the grain pattern and actually burn parts of it, but barely engrave other parts of it, and it gets a little bit tricky. If you go opposite the grain or 90 degrees to the grain, you typically get a better finish to it. Now, with boards like this that are too big, I cannot engrave against the grain or opposite the grain without leaving the door even more open, which I don't really want to do. But at some point, I'll try to do a video on the whole grain situation. But I wanted to let you know that that is something to consider. Now, these boards are hardwood. The grain is more tightly packed, which means the chances of that beam going down and burning are drastically reduced. On top of that, because it's being filled with epoxy, it's not that big of a deal on these boards. So I'm going to go ahead and engrave them with the grain, show you what those look like, and go from there. From the design side, I'm just going to put it in, line it up with the camera, and engrave it. Not a big deal there, but let me show you how that ends up looking. So I've got my design here. I'm just going to hit print because it doesn't really matter where it goes in the artboard. Choose my engraver, hit print again. Now what I need to do is actually boot up the machine so that I can see the camera. Now that the machine is booted up and I can see the camera, you can see my image here. Now keep in mind that the cutting board where I want to engrave is not really center of the laser, but I am going to try to get it in the best position as possible. So I'm going to drag the image down, and I'm going to go from the edge of the juice groove and just go in about, I would say, 1/2 of an inch. So move it that way. And from the Y direction, I'm pretty close to the edge of the juice groove, but it's not showing on the camera because this board is bigger than the bed. So what I'm going to do is subtract about 0.4 off of that one, get it in a position that's close to where he has the tape. And then for the engraving, typically when I go through here, I do have a cutting board engraving that is 75% speed, 75% power at 400 DPI. That usually gives me a nice crisp look. Now, because he wants these deeper, I'm going to have to engrave it a few times. So for cycles, I can make it 2 to start with, see how that goes, and then just hit print and send it over to the machine. Once it's all set up and sent to the machine, I just hit go and let it work. I ended up doing 3 passes on this design in order to get it to be deep enough for an epoxy inlay. This is what it turned out like. You can see that it does have some depth to it. It's kind of hard to see on camera, but it has enough depth to it to do the epoxy. It does have a nice dark finish when it comes to engraving on this material. This looks like it could be maybe maple or You know what? I'm not sure which one this is. But it turned out really nice. Looks nice and clean. But that's how I go about engraving cutting boards. It's not a one-stop process for everything. It depends on the kind of board you're using. It depends on what you're trying to do with it, the kind of finish you want, all of those things. So this is more of a starting point for things to look at. So look at grain direction, and if you want to engrave with or against that grain. Determine what you want to do with the design. Do you want to fill it with epoxy? Do you want it to just look good? Is it just like a light engraving? All those kind of things play into this. Keep in mind that when you're doing cutting boards, especially high-end cutting boards like this, people typically want to refinish them after a few years, which means sanding them down. And you want to make sure that your engraving is deep enough to withstand whatever refinishing that it does, at least for the first time or two that it's refinished. There are some tricks in order to get the engraving to be darker, depending on the wood and everything else. And I'll try to cover those in a different video. This video, I really just wanted to focus on showing you how I do a cutting board that doesn't fit in the quote work area. And hopefully this has been helpful. If the video has been helpful, give the video a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications so that you know when I come out with new videos. And be sure to comment below what other videos you'd like to see, because it will help the channel. I'll be able to put out content that will help all of you and make it so that this channel can keep growing. Also, be sure to follow me over on Instagram @MakerExperiment, where I share things like this along the way. I want to thank you for taking the time to watch this video, and I'll see you in the next one.